Hello world, Lisa Friedrichsen, your friend and computer science professor with another short screencast about JavaScript. In this screencast, we'll continue our why, what, when, and now where discussion of functions. Where do we run functions? And you'll find functions different places in your code. As inline code, embedded code, which I've demonstrated here in these YouTubes, as an external file, and also thrown around inside your script, sometimes passed as an argument. We're going to talk about all those things. I've been using an embedded script directly inside the HTML file to demonstrate my JavaScript just because it's more convenient. Of course, we would want to, in the real world, remove that JavaScript and put it in its own file. I'll do a file save as. We want to store that script in an external file so that we could link that file to many different web pages. This also allows your code editor to focus on only one language. So sometimes you get better color coding when you're working with only one language in a file. If I remove my JavaScript and put it in an external file, then you probably know that in the script tag, you need to do an src attribute and then point to that JavaScript file. And I can just reference my where.js file using the src attribute. Interestingly, you cannot use both the src attribute and put JavaScript directly into the script element. It's one or the other. However, you can have multiple script elements in an HTML file. So if you want to include some embedded JavaScript directly in this file that only works on this page, as well as link out to a library or an external file, you can most certainly do that. So those are the two most common places where you see your JavaScript, as an embedded script or as an external script, which is where you want to put all your global JavaScript. However, it's very common to see JavaScript put directly inside the opening HTML tag of an HTML element. And I highly discourage this because it's really hard to read and it's impossible to reuse. Putting inline JavaScript in the opening tag of an HTML element is akin to using the style attribute. This would be an inline style and very limited. It would apply only to that one element. It's hard to read, it's impossible to reuse, it's extremely difficult to maintain. So inline styles are frowned upon just like inline JavaScript is frowned upon. Now I realize that there are some libraries and some frameworks that use components where they put HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in these components together, and then you can reuse the components. In those situations, yes, you might have your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all combined in an opening HTML tag. For the most part, when you're coding this from scratch, when you're learning HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, I highly recommend you use separate files for each and then focus on one language per file. However, having said that, I want to show you what inline JavaScript looks like because you'll see it all over the internet in examples. And the reason you see it all over the internet in examples is because it's convenient, just like this inline style attribute is convenient. And then there's our CSS declaration. We can also have inline JavaScript, for example, on attributes such as onclick. And oftentimes you'll see functions defined in an external file and then referenced in inline JavaScript. So I'm going to copy that get values function and put it right here on the onclick attribute. Now notice in this case that my JavaScript does reference the function name and also runs the function, but that code does not get read until the click event happens. So in this case, when we use inline JavaScript, we do use the left and right parentheses behind the function name. I see this all the time in my travels on the internet, and I highly recommend that you don't do that. I highly recommend that you use either the onclick event property or the addEventListener method, as we discussed in the previous lesson. Keep all your JavaScript separated over here in the JS file and not commingled inside your HTML. By putting it in the HTML like I'm showing you now, you make it harder to read and harder to maintain. So I'm showing you this so that you can see it and recognize it for what it is. So I'm going to save and click my refresh, and let's enter a couple new numbers, 70 and 60, and click my calculate the average button and see it's still working even though I'm triggering that function right here in the opening HTML tag, as opposed to running it from the onclick event or an addEventListener method over here in my JavaScript. So now I've got my JavaScript and my HTML commingled. And people, it can get even worse than that. Let's remove this entire script and save and put the entire function right here. So we're not limited to just this one statement in the onclick attribute. We could code this entire function right here. And I'm going to go down a few lines to give myself some more room. So now I've got the entire function defined in the onclick attribute. I have to change my syntax here because quotation marks are reserved for HTML. I'm going to have to just use apostrophes all the time for this to work. So I both defined the function and run the function on the onclick HTML attribute. Save, refresh, let's try 50 and 40. We're getting worse scores here, and it's still working. So this is another thing, crazy thing you'll see in your travels on the internet, is all the JavaScript commingled inside this opening HTML attribute. This is particularly bad because obviously now this getValues function is locked up here inside this opening HTML element, and I couldn't use the getValues function anywhere else. In my opinion, using these on attributes, onclick, onBlur, onChange in the HTML is a bad idea for a beginner, but you'll see it on the internet and I wanted to show it to you. I'm going to take that out, back to our good practices of putting all of our JavaScript in an external file. And I want to show you one other thing. As we discussed in the previous screencast, there's two ways to assign the getValues function to the click of this button, using the onclick event property or using the addEventListener. As you know from the previous screencast, the addEventListener method is the preferred way because it's more powerful, it's more flexible, it allows you to assign multiple functions to the same event on an element. However, sometimes I see it get abused in this way. I copy and paste that statement down, and instead of seeing the values function there, every once in a while, actually quite commonly, I'll see a student not reference the function name there, but rather for that second argument, pass in an anonymous function. And it looks like this. So many times I'll see a student turn in a homework assignment where they're using the addEventListener method, great. They're referencing their event, great. And then they're passing in an anonymous function for that second argument. And that's another problem because while it works, it only works for this one huge statement that we're losing two of the benefits of creating a function in the first place. An anonymous function. We don't really have a name for what this function's doing. Second of all, we can't reuse that function because A, it doesn't have a name, and B, it's locked up as the second argument of this addEventListener method. So while that's possible, that's also a bad idea. Pull your functions out, give them a meaningful name, piece of documentation to give your functions meaningful names, then merely reference the function here in the addEventListener method. There is one time when using an anonymous function, however, does make sense. And that is when you're trying to pass in a function as the second argument that has parameters. So let me just give you a theoretical example. What if our function used arguments, required arguments to run? GetValues does not, left, right, parenthesis, there's no parameters defined there. But what if we had a function getValues2 and it required a parameter? Well, if I put that value in there, if I pass that function argument in order for it to run, look, the parentheses are going to go ahead and run it, and the parentheses are going to put the return value of that whole function as that second argument. And that's not what I want. I want the getValues2 function, this theoretical function, to run with 50 passed in as a parameter when the click event happens on this button. How do I accomplish that? That's where an anonymous function can really come in handy. So you simply create an anonymous function for one purpose, and that is to protect a real function that you want to run. So I've indented this a little bit so you can see what's going on. In this case, if you want to pass in a function that has parameters, so you have to pass in arguments to the addEventListener method, You can protect that function from running immediately by surrounding it with an anonymous function. So the anonymous function protects the code. It doesn't go ahead and run. It doesn't return a value yet until the click of that element is achieved, and then this whole anonymous function runs, which in turn runs this new function that requires these parameters. So that's a great place to use an anonymous function in an addEventListener method. And I've been meaning to mention the Airbnb JavaScript style guide for some time now. This is one of the most popular style guides to write JavaScript. Oftentimes, there are more than one correct way to get a job done. But the Airbnb JavaScript style guide is a comprehensive style guide on how to write JavaScript so that the entire code base for a company all looks like it came from one person. And that just makes it easier to maintain and read down the road, no matter how many programmers and developers are working with it. I find this style guide very, very helpful. Not that we have to abide by it 100%, particularly when we're learning, but it does give us a lot of guidelines on how to write professional, well-documented, readable code. It gives us both good and bad examples of common ways to write the code. And not that we are going to focus on this as beginners, but it's good to be aware of this so that we try to work in the professional habits as soon as possible when we're writing our code. Anything from how to space and indent your code, to where to place your curly braces, to whether or not to use apostrophes or quotation marks on strings. All of those things are discussed in detail in the GitHub repository of the Airbnb JavaScript style guide. And to find it, just go to Google and type in Airbnb, the company, JavaScript style guide, and it'll be that top link here at GitHub. Thank you.